Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Whether you're here because sleep won't come, because your mind needs something to chew on during the late shift, or because you've simply run out of ways to avoid your own thoughts, you've found the right corner of the internet. This is where we dig into the stories that textbooks forgot to make interesting, where we let mysteries stay mysterious, and where the past gets to speak at its own pace. If this kind of deep, slow storytelling helps you think, sleep, or simply exist a little more peacefully, consider hitting that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm that thoughtful content still has a place in this world, and honestly, we need all the help we can get. Drop a comment if you want. Tell me how you're using this video. Are you winding down for the night, working through a project, hiding in the bathroom at a family gathering? I'm genuinely curious where these stories end up. Now let's begin with something that happened so slowly, so quietly, that the participants had no idea they were changing the course of two species forever. Picture this: 30,000 years ago, somewhere in the frozen expanse of what we now call Europe, a fire crackles in the darkness. Around it, a small group of humans huddles for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The flames cast dancing shadows on mammoth bones arranged as windbreaks. And beyond the circle of light, something watches. It's not quite a wolf, but it's not anything else we have a name for either. Its amber eyes reflect the firelight as it sits just outside the reach of warmth, neither approaching nor retreating. This isn't the first night it's been here, and it won't be the last. What we're witnessing is the beginning of the most profound partnership in human history. Not the invention of agriculture, not the discovery of fire, not even the development of language. This is the story of how two apex predators looked at each other across a species divide and decided, against all evolutionary logic, to stop being afraid. This is the story of how wolves became dogs. But more than that, it's the story of how dogs became us, and we became them, in ways so subtle and complete that we're only just beginning to understand what actually happened during those long, cold millennia when the world was young and two species were quietly rewriting the rules of what it meant to be human. For most of our existence, humans and wolves were competitors. We hunted the same prey, occupied similar ecological niches, and viewed each other with the wariness that apex predators reserve for their equals. Wolves were powerful, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to environments that pushed humans to their limits. They had everything we lacked: superior senses, natural weapons, and an unshakable confidence in their place in the natural order. But somewhere between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, something unprecedented began to unfold. Not in a single moment of inspiration, not through some act of ancient genius, but through the slow accumulation of choices so small they barely registered as choices at all. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly incomplete. Bones preserve, but behaviours don't. We can measure skull dimensions and carbon date campfire remains, but we can't capture the moment when fear transformed into curiosity, when threat became opportunity, when a wolf decided to linger rather than flee. What we do know is this: around 30,000 years ago, in scattered locations across Eurasia, something began to change in the relationship between humans and wolves. The evidence appears in fragments: a skull here, a jawbone there, tool marks that suggest butchery, but also signs of care. Bones of canids found in human settlements, but not scattered like the remains of prey animals. Instead, they're positioned in ways that suggest intention, perhaps even reverence. At Goyet Cave in Belgium, archaeologists discovered what might be one of the earliest examples of this transformation. Deep in the limestone chambers, they found the skull of a canid that defied easy classification. It was larger than a modern dog, but smaller than the wolves of its time. Its features suggested something intermediate, something caught between wild and tame. The skull was dated to around 36,000 years ago, placing it at the very beginning of this mysterious transition. But here's what makes the Goyet find so intriguing. The skull wasn't discarded carelessly, like the bones of hunted animals. It was positioned deliberately, almost ceremonially. There were no cut marks suggesting it had been butchered for food, no signs of the violence we'd expect if wolves and humans were simply predators competing for resources. Similar finds began appearing across Europe and Asia. In the Czech Republic, at sites like Předmostí, canid remains turned up in association with mammoth hunters who had established semi-permanent settlements. Again, the bones told a story of proximity rather than conflict, of coexistence rather than competition. The more archaeologists looked, the more they found evidence of what scientists now call the camp follower hypothesis. The idea is elegantly simple. As human settlements became more stable, more predictable sources of food waste, some wolves began to linger at the edges of these communities. Not as pets, that concept wouldn't exist for millennia, but as opportunistic scavengers who had learned to read human behaviour well enough to know when it was safe to approach and when it was time to disappear. This wasn't domestication, as we understand it today. There were no leashes, no breeding programs, no deliberate selection for desirable traits. Instead, what emerged was a kind of behavioural negotiation, a dance between species that played out over hundreds of generations. The wolves that succeeded in this new niche weren't necessarily the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the ones with the psychological flexibility to tolerate human presence, to remain calm in the face of fire and voices and the constant activity of camp life. They were the ones who could distinguish between a thrown stone, meant as a threat, and scraps of food tossed aside as waste. Over time, these behavioural traits would have been passed on to their offspring, not through conscious selection by humans, but through the simple mathematics of survival. The wolves who could coexist with humans had access to more reliable food sources, especially during the harsh winters when natural prey was scarce. Their pups inherited not just their genes, but their learned behaviours, their tolerance for human proximity, their ability to read the subtle cues that meant safety or danger. The humans, meanwhile, were undergoing their own adaptation. Living alongside these proto-dogs would have changed the dynamics of camp life in ways both subtle and profound. A wolf's superior hearing could provide early warning of approaching predators or rival human groups. Their presence might have deterred other scavengers from approaching food stores, and perhaps most importantly, they offered something that humans had never had before, a non-human ally. This alliance wasn't built on dominance or submission, but on mutual benefit. The wolves gained access to food and shelter. The humans gained security and companionship. Neither species set out to change the other, but change they did, slowly and irrevocably. The genetic evidence for this transformation is only now beginning to emerge, thanks to advances in ancient DNA analysis. When scientists extract DNA from the bones of these early canids, they find something remarkable, a genetic signature that's distinct from modern wolves, but not yet fully dog-like. These animals represent something unique in evolutionary history, a species in the process of becoming something new. What's particularly fascinating is that this transformation doesn't appear to have happened just once. The genetic data suggests multiple populations of wolves, in different regions and at different times, began the journey toward domestication. Some of these lineages survived and contributed to the dogs we know today. Others vanished without a trace, evolutionary experiments that flickered briefly before disappearing into the fossil record. The climate during this period played a crucial role in shaping this relationship. The last glacial maximum, which peaked around 23,000 years ago, created conditions that pushed both species to their limits. The harsh, unforgiving landscape left little room for waste. Resources were scarce, competition was fierce, and survival often came down to the thinnest of margins. In these extreme conditions, cooperation became a matter of survival. The wolves who had learned to coexist with humans found themselves better positioned to weather the worst of the Ice Age. They had access to the warmth of human fires, to the scraps from successful hunts, to the protection that came with being part of a group larger than any wolf pack. The humans, meanwhile, discovered that their canine companions brought advantages they hadn't anticipated. In the vast, white silence of the glacial landscape, a dog's superior senses could mean the difference between finding game and starving. Their ability to track scents across frozen ground, to hear the approach of predators long before human ears could detect them, made them invaluable partners in the struggle for survival. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For the first time in human history, we were no longer alone in our intelligence. Dogs didn't think like us, but they thought with us. They could understand our gestures, respond to our emotions, anticipate our needs in ways that no other animal had ever done. This cognitive partnership would have far-reaching consequences. Living with dogs changed how humans thought about other species, about intelligence, about the nature of consciousness itself. We began to see animals not just as resources or threats, but as individuals with their own personalities, their own ways of understanding the world. The archaeological evidence for this growing bond becomes clearer as we move forward in time. By 15,000 years ago, we begin to find dogs buried alongside humans, not as sacrificial offerings, but as companions. These burials suggest that the relationship had deepened beyond mere utility into something approaching what we might recognize as love. The most famous of these early burials comes from Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, where archaeologists discovered the remains of 2 humans and a dog, all buried together with care and ceremony. The dog was young, probably less than a year old. An examination of its bones revealed something remarkable. It had survived distemper, a disease that is almost always fatal in wild canids. For this puppy to have survived distemper, someone would have had to care for it through weeks of illness, hand-feeding it, protecting it from predators, nursing it through fever and weakness. This wasn't the behaviour of people who saw dogs as tools or possessions. This was the behaviour of people who had formed emotional bonds with their canine companions. The Bonn Oberkassel burial is just one example of a pattern that emerges across Europe and Asia during this period. As the Ice Age waned and human societies became more complex, dogs became increasingly integrated into human life. They weren't just tolerated, they were valued, cared for, mourned when they died. This growing emotional attachment wasn't happening in isolation. As the ice retreated and the world warmed, human societies were undergoing their own transformation. The nomadic lifestyle that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years was giving way to something new. Settlement, agriculture, the first tentative steps towards civilization. And through it all, dogs were there, not just as witnesses to human progress, but as active participants in it. They weren't following us into the future, they were helping to create it alongside us. But to understand how profound this partnership truly was, we need to look beyond the archaeological record, beyond the bones and burial sites, into the realm of genetics. Because what the DNA tells us about this ancient relationship is far stranger and more complex than anyone could have imagined. In the early 2000s, scientists began extracting genetic material from the bones of ancient dogs and wolves, hoping to trace the evolutionary path from wild predator to domestic companion. What they found was a story written in code, a molecular narrative that revealed the true complexity of this transformation. The genetic evidence shows that all modern dogs, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, share a common ancestor. Not the grey wolves that still roam our forests today, but an extinct population of wolves that lived somewhere in Eurasia between 30 and 20,000 years ago. This ancestral population is what scientists call a ghost lineage, a group that left no direct descendants except through their domesticated offspring. Think about that for a moment. The wild ancestors of our dogs no longer exist. They vanish so completely that we know them only through the genetic echoes preserved in their domesticated descendants. It's as if the very act of becoming dogs somehow erased their wild origins from the earth. This ghost lineage tells us something profound about the nature of domestication. It wasn't a simple process of humans selecting wolves with desirable traits. Instead, it was a complex dance of evolution, environment, and chance that transformed both species in ways neither could have anticipated. The genetic clock suggests that dogs began diverging from their wolf ancestors around the peak of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and Asia. This timing isn't coincidental. The extreme conditions of the Ice Age created evolutionary pressures that favoured cooperation over competition, partnership over isolation. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. The genetic evidence suggests that this transformation didn't happen just once, in one place. Instead, multiple populations of wolves, scattered across different regions, began the journey toward domestication. Some of these attempts succeeded, others failed. The dogs we know today are the descendants of the successful experiments, the lineages that managed to navigate the complex transition from wild to domestic. This parallel evolution explains why early dog remains are found in such widely scattered locations. From the mammoth hunters of Siberia to the reindeer herders of Scandinavia, from the cave dwellers of Europe to the coastal peoples of the Americas, humans were forming partnerships with canids. Each of these relationships had its own character, its own trajectory, its own eventual fate. Some of these early dog populations left no genetic legacy. They flourished for thousands of years, then vanished as their human partners migrated, died out, or were replaced by other groups. These extinct lineages are visible in the archaeological record as bones that don't quite match any known breed, as skulls with features that seem to blend wolf and dog characteristics in ways that no longer exist. The Americas provide one of the most poignant examples of this genetic loss. When the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America, they brought dogs with them. These early American dogs, descendants of the Siberian populations that had already begun the journey toward domestication, spread throughout the continent. They lived alongside the first Americans for thousands of years, adapting to new environments, new prey species, new ways of life. But when European colonists arrived in the Americas, they brought their own dogs, animals that had evolved along different genetic lines, with different characteristics, different resistances to disease. Over time, these European dogs largely replaced the Native American lineages. Today, most of the genetic heritage of those first American dogs has been lost, surviving only in isolated populations and in the DNA of a few modern breeds. This pattern of replacement and loss repeated itself throughout human history. As populations migrated, merged and conquered one another, their dogs went with them. The victor's dogs often survived. The vanquished dogs often disappeared. Each wave of human expansion carried with it a genetic bottleneck that narrowed the diversity of our canine companions. But loss wasn't the only force shaping dog evolution. As human societies became more complex, more specialized, they began to select for different traits in their dogs. The nomadic hunters of the Arctic needed animals that could pull sleds across frozen tundra. The farmers of the Fertile Crescent needed dogs that could guard livestock and protect crops. The traders of ancient civilizations needed companions that could adapt to urban environments. These different selection pressures led to an explosion of diversity in dog breeds. By the time written history begins, we find evidence of dozens of distinct types of dogs, each adapted to specific roles, specific environments, specific human needs. The sleek sighthounds of ancient Egypt, bred for speed and grace. The massive mastiffs of Mesopotamia, bred for strength and intimidation. The the small lapdogs of ancient China, bred for companionship and beauty. This diversification accelerated as human civilization grew more sophisticated. Dogs weren't just working animals anymore. They were symbols of status, objects of art, companions in leisure as well as labour. The relationship that had begun with a wolf lingering at the edge of a campfire had evolved into something far more complex and multifaceted. But even as dogs became more specialised, more removed from their wild origins, something essential remained unchanged: the bond itself. The capacity for cross-species communication, for emotional attachment, for mutual understanding that had first emerged in those Ice Age camps, continued to define the human-dog relationship. Modern neuroscience is beginning to reveal just how deep this bond runs. When humans and dogs look into each other's eyes, both species release oxytocin, the same hormone that promotes bonding between human parents and children. This biochemical response suggests that the emotional connection between humans and dogs isn't just cultural or learned. It's been literally wired into our nervous systems through thousands of years of coevolution. Dogs have evolved the ability to read human facial expressions, to respond to pointing gestures, to distinguish between different human emotions. They can learn human words, understand human routines, even anticipate human needs. No other animal, not even our closest primate relatives, shows this level of social cognition when interacting with humans. Humans, meanwhile, have evolved complementary abilities. We're remarkably good at reading dog body language, at interpreting their vocalizations, at predicting their behavior. We respond to their distress signals, their play invitations, their attempts to communicate across the species barrier. This isn't just training or experience, it's an evolved capacity that emerges naturally in human children, often before they can walk or talk. This mutual adaptation extends beyond behavior into the realm of biology. Dogs have evolved the ability to digest starch, allowing them to thrive on human food scraps. Humans have evolved genetic variants that help us process the proteins in dog saliva and dander, reducing allergic reactions. Even our sleep cycles have adapted to each other. Dogs naturally adjust their activity patterns to match their human companions, while humans sleep more soundly when dogs are present to provide security. The coevolution of humans and dogs represents one of the most successful partnerships in natural history. Together, our two species have colonized every continent, adapted to every climate, thrived in environments that neither could have conquered alone. From the Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from ancient villages to modern cities, the human-dog bond has proven remarkably resilient and adaptable. Yet for all our scientific understanding of this relationship, something ineffable remains. When you look into a dog's eyes and see recognition, intelligence, affection reflected back at you, you're experiencing something that began 30,000 years ago, around a fire in the darkness. That moment of connection across species lines, that recognition of kinship between predators, that decision to trust rather than fear, it echoes still in every interaction between human and dog. The transformation from wolf to dog wasn't just about changing bodies or behaviours, it was about changing consciousness, about expanding the definition of family, about learning to see intelligence and emotion in forms different from our own. In domesticating dogs, we didn't just gain working partners or companions, we gained teachers who showed us new ways of being social, new forms of communication, new possibilities for connection across the boundaries that separate species. This lesson in cross-species empathy may be one of the most important gifts dogs have given us. Learning to understand and care for animals so different from ourselves prepared us, in some small way, for the challenges of living in a diverse world, of communicating across cultural differences, of finding common ground with those who don't share our language or our perspective. The story of how wolves became dogs is ultimately a story about transformation, not just of one species but of two. We shaped dogs through our choices, our needs, our dreams, of what a companion could be. But dogs shaped us too, teaching us lessons about loyalty, about unconditional love, about finding joy in simple pleasures. They showed us that intelligence comes in many forms, that families can transcend biological boundaries, that home isn't just a place but a feeling of belonging. As we move deeper into this ancient partnership, the archaeological record begins to tell us something remarkable about the nature of change itself. Because what happened between humans and wolves wasn't a sudden breakthrough. It was a cascade of tiny adaptations, each one so subtle that the participants themselves probably never noticed they were part of something revolutionary. By 25,000 years ago, scattered across the frozen landscape of northern Eurasia, we start finding evidence of something that archaeologists call intermediate forms. These are canid remains that don't fit neatly into either category. Too small and gracile to be wolves, too large and robust to be what we'd recognise as dogs. They represent something caught in the middle of becoming, fossils of transformation itself. At sites like Predmosty in the Czech Republic, buried beneath layers of mammoth bones and stone tools, archaeologists have uncovered skulls that tell this story of gradual change. The snouts are shorter than a wolf's, but longer than a modern dog's. The teeth are smaller than their wild ancestors, but not yet as reduced as we see in fully domesticated animals. The brain cases show a subtle shift in shape, becoming slightly more rounded, slightly more juvenile in appearance, a process scientists call neoteny, where adult animals retain characteristics typically seen only in young animals. This physical transformation was accompanied by behavioural changes that we can only infer from the archaeological context. These proto-dogs weren't just scavenging at the edges of human camps anymore. Their remains are found integrated into living spaces, near hearths, in areas that suggest they were tolerated, even welcomed, into the intimate sphere of human daily life. The evidence suggests these animals had crossed some invisible threshold of trust. They were close enough to human activities to be accidentally trampled, close enough to fires to be singed, close enough to food preparation areas to gnaw on discarded bones, while families worked around them. This level of proximity would have been impossible without a fundamental shift in both species' behaviour, humans learning to tolerate potentially dangerous predators in their living spaces, and wolves learning to suppress their natural fear and wariness around humans. But the most intriguing evidence comes from what's missing in these archaeological layers. In sites where we find these intermediate canids, we see a dramatic reduction in the bones of other scavengers. Hyenas, foxes, and other opportunistic feeders seem to have been displaced from areas where humans lived. The implication is clear. The proto-dogs weren't just coexisting with humans. They were actively defending human spaces from other scavengers. This territorial behaviour represents a crucial evolutionary step. These animals had begun to identify with human groups rather than their own kind. They were investing energy in protecting human resources, human spaces, human interests. In behavioural terms, they had switched sides in the ancient competition between humans and other predators. The genetic evidence from this period, extracted painstakingly from ancient bones, reveals the molecular signature of this transformation. DNA analysis shows that by 20,000 years ago, these proto-dogs had already begun to diverge significantly from contemporary wolf populations. Not just in isolated mutations, but in systematic changes across multiple gene systems that control everything from stress response to social behaviour to physical development. One of the most significant changes involved the genes that regulate the production of stress hormones. Wild wolves have hair-trigger stress responses. They're constantly ready to fight or flee, their nervous systems primed for instant reaction to any potential threat. But living in close proximity to humans required a different kind of nervous system, one that could remain calm in the face of constant stimulation, constant noise, constant human activity. The proto-dogs that thrived in human environments were those whose stress response had been naturally dampened. They could tolerate the chaos of camp life without being driven into a state of constant panic. This wasn't conscious selection by humans. It was environmental selection by circumstances. The animals that could handle the stress of human proximity were the ones that survived and reproduced. This genetic shift toward a reduced stress response had cascading effects throughout their biology. Animals with lower stress hormone levels tend to mature more slowly, retaining juvenile characteristics longer. They're more playful, more curious, more willing to explore novel situations. They're also more likely to form social bonds with individuals outside their immediate family group. In essence, the environmental pressure of living with humans was selecting for animals that remained psychologically young throughout their lives. This juvenilization wasn't just behavioral, it was physical. The shortened snouts, the floppy ears, the high-pitched vocalizations we associate with domestic dogs are all juvenile characteristics that became permanently fixed in adult animals. This process, which scientists call domestication syndrome, appears to be a universal feature of animal domestication. Whether we're talking about dogs, cats, horses, or cattle, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Domesticated animals tend to look and act more like juvenile versions of their wild ancestors. It's as if the process of living with humans somehow locks these species into a permanent state of adolescence. But here's what makes the dog story unique. This transformation appears to have been largely self-directed. Unlike later domestication efforts, where humans actively captured and bred wild animals, the initial stages of dog domestication seem to have been driven by the animals themselves. They chose to approach human settlements. They chose to tolerate human presence. They chose to remain when their wild cousins fled. This self-domestication hypothesis is supported by modern examples of similar processes. In cities around the world, we can observe populations of urban animals, foxes, raccoons, coyotes, that are becoming increasingly tolerant of human presence. Over just a few generations, these animals show measurable changes in behavior, stress response, and even physical appearance as they adapt to urban environments. The difference is that 30,000 years ago, there were no cities to provide these opportunities for close human-animal contact. The only way for wolves to experience prolonged exposure to human behavior was to actively seek it out, to make the conscious choice to linger at the edges of human camps, despite their natural instincts telling them to flee. This suggests something remarkable about the cognitive abilities of these ancient wolves. They weren't just reacting to immediate stimuli, they were making calculated decisions about risk and reward, weighing the benefits of accessing human food sources against the dangers of approaching potential predators. They were, in effect, conducting their own behavioral experiments in interspecies cooperation. The success of these experiments can be measured in the archaeological record. Sites with evidence of proto-dog presence show signs of more successful human habitation. Larger food stores, more elaborate tool assemblages, evidence of longer-term occupation. The humans who accepted these canine partners weren't just gaining companionship, they were gaining a survival advantage. This advantage became even more pronounced as the climate began to shift. Around 18,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum began to wane. The massive ice sheets that had covered northern Europe and Asia started their slow retreat, fundamentally altering the landscape and the ecosystems that both humans and proto-dogs had adapted to. The megafauna that had sustained both species, woolly mammoths, cave bears, giant deer, began to decline and eventually disappear. The wide-open steppes that had supported these massive herds gave way to dense forests as the climate warmed. Both humans and their canine partners were forced to adapt to a world that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. In this changing environment, the partnership between humans and proto-dogs proved its worth. Dogs' superior senses became even more valuable in dense forest environments where visibility was limited. Their ability to track scents through thick underbrush, to detect the approach of predators or prey, to navigate in conditions where human senses were inadequate, made them indispensable partners in the struggle to adapt to post-glacial ecosystems. But perhaps more importantly, they provided psychological stability during a period of unprecedented change. For species that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in Ice Age conditions, the warming world must have felt alien and threatening. Having loyal, familiar companions, beings who shared the risks and rewards of this new environment, may have been crucial to human psychological adaptation. The bond between humans and proto-dogs deepened during this period of transition. We begin to see evidence not just of coexistence, but of genuine care and affection. Burial sites from this era occasionally include dogs interred alongside humans, sometimes in positions that suggest they died naturally and were mourned by their human companions. One of the most poignant examples comes from a site in Israel, where archaeologists discovered the remains of an elderly woman buried with her hand resting on the body of a small dog. Both had been carefully positioned in the grave. Both had been covered with stones and ochre in what was clearly a ceremonial burial. The message is unmistakable. This dog was not property, not a tool, not even just a companion. It was family. These burials mark a crucial psychological threshold in the human-dog relationship. For the first time in human history, we were acknowledging that non-human beings could have individual identities, could be subjects of grief and memory, could deserve the same ritual treatment we accorded to our own species. This recognition of animal personhood was revolutionary, and it would have profound implications for how humans would relate to the natural world in the millennia to come. But the most significant changes were still ahead. As human societies grew more complex, as settlements became larger and more permanent, as new technologies emerged and new forms of social organization developed, dogs would need to adapt once again. The scavenging, semi-wild animals that had first approached human campfires would need to become something entirely new, working partners in the great human experiment of civilization. The transformation that began with a wolf's decision to linger at the edge of firelight was about to accelerate into something that would reshape both species beyond recognition. The age of true domestication was beginning, and with it, a new chapter in the story of what it means to be human. As we trace this ancient partnership forward through time, we're not just following the evolution of dogs, we're following the evolution of ourselves, the gradual emergence of humans as a species capable of forming deep emotional bonds with beings fundamentally different from ourselves. In learning to love wolves, we were learning to become the kinds of beings capable of love itself. The archaeological record from this crucial period, between 20 and 15,000 years ago, reveals a world in transition. The reliable patterns of Ice Age life were dissolving, replaced by unprecedented change and uncertainty. In such times, the value of trusted companions, beings who could share the burden of adaptation, who could provide both practical assistance and emotional support, cannot be overstated. Through their partnership with proto-dogs, humans were learning lessons that would serve them well in the challenges ahead. That survival could depend on cooperation across species boundaries, that intelligence came in many forms, that the natural world could be a source of allies rather than just adversaries. These weren't abstract philosophical insights. They were practical skills honed through thousands of years of daily interaction with beings who thought differently but shared common goals. The story of how wolves became dogs is ultimately a story about the power of small choices compounded over time. No single human decided to domesticate wolves. No single wolf decided to become a dog. Instead, thousands of individuals on both sides of the species made tiny decisions to approach rather than flee, to tolerate rather than attack, to share rather than hoard. And these decisions accumulated over generations into one of the most profound transformations in the history of life on Earth. We're still living with the consequences of those ancient choices. Every time a dog looks to its human companion for guidance, every time a human feels comforted by a dog's presence, every time two beings from different species communicate across the vast biological gulf that separates them, we're experiencing echoes of those first tentative contacts around Paleolithic campfires. The bond that began in ice and hunger and mutual wariness has become one of the defining features of human civilization. It taught us that families could transcend biological boundaries, that loyalty could bridge species differences, that love could flourish in the most unlikely partnerships. In learning to live with dogs, we learned to become more fully human. But the most remarkable transformation was yet to come. As the ice retreated and the world warmed, these proto-dogs found themselves facing an entirely new challenge, learning to live not just alongside humans, but within human society itself. Around 15,000 years ago, something unprecedented began happening in archaeological sites across Eurasia. The scattered bones and occasional burials that had marked the early stages of the human-dog relationship gave way to something far more systematic, evidence of dogs being integrated into the fundamental structures of human life. At sites like Natufian settlements in the Levant, we find the first clear evidence of dogs living not at the periphery of human communities, but at their very centre. These weren't seasonal visitors or opportunistic scavengers anymore. They were residents with their own designated spaces within human dwellings, their own roles in daily routines, their own places in the social hierarchy of the group. The physical transformation of these animals had accelerated dramatically. By this period, many of the canids found in human settlements would be immediately recognizable to us as dogs rather than wolves. Their skulls had shortened and broadened. Their teeth had become smaller and more crowded. Their limbs had shortened relative to their body size. Most tellingly, their brains had begun to reorganize in ways that enhanced their ability to communicate with humans, while diminishing their capacity for independent survival in the wild. This neurological rewiring is perhaps the most profound aspect of domestication, though it's also the hardest to detect in the fossil record. Modern brain imaging studies of dogs and wolves reveal stark differences in neural architecture. Dogs have enlarged regions associated with social cognition and reduced areas linked to fear and aggression. They've essentially traded wild intelligence for social intelligence, becoming brilliant at reading human cues while losing much of their ancestral ability to navigate complex natural environments. But this wasn't a simple trade-off imposed by human selection. The archaeological evidence suggests that dogs were active participants in this transformation, continuously refining their ability to integrate into human society. They were learning, generation by generation, how to be useful in ways that went far beyond their original role as camp followers. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of working relationships that required genuine cooperation between species. Dogs weren't just scavenging anymore, they were beginning to participate in human economic activities. The first evidence of this appears in the form of specialized tool marks on animal bones, cut patterns that suggest dogs were being used to help process kills, to carry loads, perhaps even to assist in the hunt itself. The most dramatic example comes from sites in northern Siberia, where archaeologists have found evidence of what might be the world's first sled dogs. At Zhukov Island, dating to around 9,000 years ago, they discovered the remains of dogs that show clear signs of having been used for heavy pulling work. These animals had developed enlarged chest muscles, reinforced spinal structures, and wear patterns on their bones, consistent with hauling heavy loads across snow and ice. These weren't just functional adaptations, they represent a conceptual breakthrough in human thinking about the possibilities of interspecies cooperation. For the first time, humans were asking dogs to do more than simply coexist. They were asking them to work, to contribute their unique abilities to human survival strategies in systematic, organized ways. The implications of this shift extend far beyond simple utility. Working relationships require communication, trust, and mutual understanding at levels that had never existed between humans and any other species. A sled dog must learn to respond to voice commands, to gauge the mood and intentions of its human handler, to make split-second decisions about safety and direction while pulling a load across treacherous terrain. The human, in turn, must learn to read the dog's signals about ice conditions, weather changes, and potential dangers that human senses might miss. This level of interspecies cooperation required both species to develop new forms of intelligence. Dogs had to become more attuned to human communication, more responsive to training, more capable of understanding complex instructions. Humans had to become more skilled at animal psychology, more sensitive to non-verbal communication, more capable of thinking in terms of partnership rather than dominance. The genetic evidence from this period reveals the molecular basis of these changes. DNA extracted from ancient dog bones shows rapid evolution in genes associated with neural development, stress response, and social behavior. These weren't random mutations. They represent systematic genetic reorganization, driven by the demands of living and working in close partnership with humans. Particularly significant are changes in genes that regulate the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. Dogs evolved to produce these chemicals in response to human contact, creating a biochemical reward system that reinforced cooperation and bonding. In effect, dogs became neurologically addicted to human approval, finding genuine pleasure in pleasing their human partners. Humans underwent parallel changes, though these are harder to detect in ancient remains. Modern studies suggest that prolonged contact with dogs has influenced human evolution as well, selecting for traits like enhanced empathy, improved non-verbal communication skills, and increased tolerance for caring for dependent individuals. The capacity to form deep emotional bonds with dogs may have prepared our ancestors for the complex social relationships that would become necessary as human societies grew larger and more sophisticated. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological rather than physical. Living with working dogs required humans to think about other species in entirely new ways. Dogs weren't just tools or resources. They were partners with their own personalities, their own preferences, their own ways of understanding the world. Humans had to learn to accommodate these differences, to work with rather than against canine nature. This shift in perspective had implications that went far beyond the human-dog relationship. Learning to see intelligence and agency in dogs prepared humans to recognize these qualities in other species as well. The domestication of sheep, goats, cattle, and horses that followed would build on psychological foundations laid during the early relationship with dogs. The archaeological record from this period also reveals the first clear evidence of emotional attachment between humans and individual dogs. Burial sites become more elaborate, more personal. Dogs are interred not just alongside humans, but with grave goods of their own, carved bones, shell ornaments, even miniature tools that suggest they were thought to need equipment for an afterlife. One particularly poignant example comes from a site in Germany, where archaeologists found the burial of an elderly man accompanied by two dogs of very different sizes. One was large and robust, clearly a working animal. The other was small and delicate, with bones that showed signs of having been cared for through a long illness. The arrangement of the burial suggests that these weren't just the man's dogs, but his companions, each valued for different qualities, one for its strength and utility, the other perhaps for its loyalty and affection. These burials mark a crucial moment in the evolution of human consciousness. For the first time, we see clear evidence that humans were capable of recognizing individuality in non-human beings, of forming personal relationships that transcended species boundaries, of experiencing grief for the death of creatures fundamentally different from themselves. This emotional capacity would prove crucial as human societies continued to evolve. The ability to form deep, lasting bonds with dogs prepared humans for the complex emotional landscape of settled life, where individuals had to maintain relationships not just with immediate family members, but with neighbours, trading partners, and eventually strangers from distant communities. The working relationship between humans and dogs also provided a template for other forms of social organisation. The hierarchical structure of dog packs, with clear leadership roles and cooperative decision-making, may have influenced the development of human political systems. The loyalty and obedience that dogs showed to their human handlers became models for the kinds of relationships that would be necessary in complex societies with formal leadership structures. By 10,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. The wolves that had first approached human campfires had become something entirely new, a species so thoroughly integrated into human society that their wild origins were barely recognizable. They had traded their independence for security, their fierce self-reliance for the comfort of belonging, their wild intelligence for the specialized knowledge needed to thrive in the human world. But this wasn't a loss so much as a metamorphosis. The dogs of this period weren't diminished versions of their wolf ancestors. They were something unprecedented in natural history, a species that had evolved specifically to live in partnership with another species. They had become, in effect, living bridges between the human and natural worlds, creatures that could move fluidly between civilization and wildness, understanding both but belonging fully to neither. This unique position would serve both species well in the challenges ahead. As human societies grew more complex, more specialized, more removed from their origins as hunter-gatherers, dogs would serve as constant reminders of humanity's connection to the natural world. They would remain, throughout all the transformations to come, as links to something older and deeper than civilization, to the ancient partnership forged in ice and hunger and mutual need around fires that burned in the darkness of the Paleolithic world. The story of how wolves became dogs is often told as a triumph of human ingenuity, a demonstration of our species' ability to reshape nature to serve our needs. But the archaeological and genetic evidence tells a more complex story, one of mutual transformation, of two species that changed each other in ways both profound and subtle. In learning to live with dogs, humans didn't just gain working partners and companions. They learned to become the kinds of beings capable of sustaining relationships based on trust, loyalty, and affection rather than fear and dominance. These lessons would prove invaluable as human societies continue to evolve. The emotional and social skills developed through thousands of years of partnership with dogs prepared our ancestors for the challenges of settled life, of agriculture, of civilization itself. In domesticating dogs, humans were also domesticating themselves, becoming more cooperative, more empathetic, more capable of the complex social relationships that civilization would require. The bond forged between humans and dogs during those ancient millennia remains one of our species' greatest achievements, not because we succeeded in controlling another species, but because we learned to live with them as equals, as partners, as family. In the end, the question isn't really how wolves became dogs. It's how, in the process of making that transformation possible, we became more fully human ourselves. As we continue to trace this ancient partnership through time, we'll see how the lessons learned during those early millennia of cooperation would shape not just the evolution of dogs, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The bond that began with a wolf's cautious approach to a Paleolithic campfire would ultimately help make possible everything we recognize as human culture. Our capacity for loyalty, our ability to form lasting relationships across differences, our understanding that intelligence and consciousness come in many forms. The transformation from wolf to dog represents more than just biological change. It represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and the natural world, from adversaries to partners, from competitors to collaborators, from strangers to family. This shift would echo through every subsequent development in human history, shaping how we think about other species, about intelligence, about the nature of consciousness itself. But to understand the full significance of this ancient partnership, we need to look beyond the bones and burial sites, beyond even the genetic evidence, into the realm of behavior and emotion and the mysterious bonds that can form between beings who share nothing more than mutual need and the courage to trust across the vast divide that separates one species from another. The transformation that began in ice and starlight was about to enter its most crucial phase. By 12,000 years ago, as the great glaciers retreated and left behind a world neither species fully recognized, humans and their canine partners found themselves facing challenges that would test everything they had learned about cooperation. The warming climate brought opportunities, but it also brought disruption. The vast steppes that had supported mammoth and reindeer gave way to dense forests. The reliable rhythms of Ice Age life dissolved into something more complex, more unpredictable. Both humans and dogs would need to adapt not just to new environments, but to entirely new ways of living. In the Levant, where wild grasses grew thick in the warming valleys, humans began to experiment with something unprecedented, staying in one place. The Natufian peoples, as archaeologists call them, built the first permanent settlements, circular stone houses arranged around central courtyards. And in these courtyards, alongside grinding stones and storage pits, we find the bones of dogs who had clearly become permanent residents. These weren't the lean, opportunistic scavengers of earlier millennia. The dogs buried at Natufian sites were stockier, more varied in size, showing signs of selective breeding that went beyond mere tolerance for human proximity. Some were large and robust, clearly suited for guard work. Others were smaller, more delicate, with bones that suggested they served primarily as companions rather than working animals. The most famous example comes from Ain Malaha, where archaeologists discovered the burial of an elderly woman, with her hand resting protectively over a small dog. The positioning was deliberate, ceremonial. Both bodies had been carefully arranged, both covered with stones and red ochre. This wasn't disposal of the dead, it was commemoration of a bond that transcended species boundaries. But perhaps more significant than these touching burials was what they represented, a fundamental shift in how humans thought about time, about permanence, about the future itself. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had lived in the present moment, following herds, responding to immediate needs. The decision to settle in one place required a different kind of thinking, the ability to plan for seasons yet to come, to invest labour in structures and relationships that would pay dividends over years rather than days. Dogs played a crucial role in making this psychological transition possible. They provided continuity in a time of unprecedented change, familiar companions whose presence helped ease the anxiety of abandoning ancient nomadic patterns. More practically, they served as living alarm systems for these early settlements, their superior senses providing early warning of approaching threats in environments where humans could no longer simply flee from danger. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of dogs being integrated into the fundamental architecture of settled life. At Jericho, one of the world's earliest walled towns, dog remains are found not scattered randomly, but positioned near gateways and defensive structures. These animals weren't just living in the settlement, they were part of its security infrastructure. This integration required new forms of training, new levels of communication between species. A dog guarding a village gate needed to distinguish between residents and strangers, between traders and raiders, between threats that required alarm and activities that should be ignored. This wasn't instinctive behaviour, it was learned, cultural knowledge passed from human to dog through patient teaching. The genetic evidence from this period reveals rapid changes in dog populations. DNA extracted from bones shows increasing diversity in size and shape, suggesting that humans were beginning to breed dogs for specific purposes rather than simply allowing natural selection to operate. Some lineages were developing the robust builds suited for guard work, others the keen senses needed for hunting in dense forest environments. But the most significant change was neurological. Brain scans of modern dogs reveal enlarged regions associated with processing human emotional cues, while areas linked to independent problem-solving have actually shrunk compared to their wolf ancestors. Dogs were becoming increasingly specialized for life in human society, trading general intelligence for social intelligence. This neurological reorganization had profound implications. Dogs weren't just learning to obey human commands, they were evolving the capacity to read human intentions, to anticipate human needs, to respond to subtle emotional cues that even other humans might miss. They were becoming, in effect, living extensions of human consciousness, creatures whose thoughts and responses were increasingly synchronized with their human partners. The humans, meanwhile, were undergoing their own adaptations. Living with dogs required new forms of patience, new skills in nonverbal communication, new ways of thinking about responsibility and care. The capacity to nurture animals through illness or injury, to maintain relationships based on loyalty rather than immediate utility, helped prepare our ancestors for the complex social bonds that settled life would require. As human settlements grew larger and more complex, dogs took on increasingly specialized roles. Some became herders, learning to control the movements of sheep and goats with remarkable precision. Others developed into hunters, working in coordinated teams to track prey through dense undergrowth. Still others served primarily as companions, their value measured not in practical utility, but in emotional support and social bonding. The emergence of herding dogs represents one of the most sophisticated examples of interspecies cooperation in natural history. These animals had to learn not just to obey commands, but to think strategically, to anticipate the movements of prey animals, to make independent decisions while remaining responsive to human direction. The level of cognitive complexity required for effective herding rivals that found in many human activities. Archaeological sites from the early Neolithic period show clear evidence of this herding relationship. At Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, one of the world's largest Neolithic settlements, the remains of dogs are found alongside those of sheep and cattle in contexts that suggest coordinated management of livestock. Tool marks on animal bones indicate systematic butchering practices that would have required careful control of herd animals, exactly the kind of work that herding dogs excel at. The development of herding behavior also reveals something profound about the nature of learning and cultural transmission in dogs. Unlike most animal behaviors, which are either instinctive or learned through direct experience, herding requires the ability to understand abstract concepts, the idea of controlling another animal's movement without harming it, the notion of working toward goals that provide no immediate reward. This capacity for abstract thinking emerged through thousands of years of coevolution with humans. Dogs learn to think in terms of future outcomes, to work toward goals that might not be achieved for hours or days. They developed the ability to generalize from specific training to novel situations, to apply learned principles in contexts they had never encountered before. The genetic basis of these behavioral changes is only now becoming clear. Recent studies have identified specific gene variants that appear to be associated with trainability, social bonding, and stress response in dogs. These aren't random mutations. They represent systematic genetic changes that enhance dogs' ability to live and work in human society. But genetics alone can't explain the full transformation. The archaeological record suggests that cultural learning, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next through observation and imitation, played a crucial role in dog evolution. Puppies didn't just inherit genes for cooperation. They learned cooperative behaviors by watching their parents interact with humans. This cultural dimension of dog evolution helps explain why the transformation happened so rapidly. Rather than waiting for beneficial mutations to arise and spread through populations over thousands of generations, dogs could acquire new behaviors within a single generation through learning. The most successful behaviors were then passed on culturally to offspring, creating a feedback loop that accelerated adaptive change. The human side of this cultural coevolution is equally fascinating. Humans developed elaborate systems of knowledge about dog behavior, training techniques, and breeding practices. This knowledge wasn't written down. Writing wouldn't be invented for several more millennia, but it was preserved and transmitted through oral tradition, demonstration, and hands-on experience. By 8,000 years ago, this accumulated knowledge had produced dogs that would be immediately recognizable to us today. At archaeological sites across Europe and the Middle East, we find remains of animals that clearly represent distinct breeds or types. Large, mastiff-like dogs suited for guarding, smaller terrier-like animals bred for hunting, and medium-sized dogs that appear to have served as general-purpose companions and workers. The diversity of these early breeds suggests that humans had developed sophisticated understanding of genetic inheritance long before they had any scientific explanation for how it worked. They knew that breeding dogs with particular traits would tend to produce offspring with similar characteristics, and they used this knowledge to create animals suited for specific purposes. This empirical understanding of genetics had implications that went far beyond dog breeding. The same principles that governed the inheritance of canine traits could be applied to crops, to livestock, eventually to understanding human inheritance patterns themselves. In learning to breed dogs, humans were developing the conceptual foundations for agriculture, animal husbandry, and ultimately for scientific thinking about heredity and variation. The psychological impact of this relationship was equally profound. Living with dogs taught humans to think about other minds, other forms of consciousness, other ways of experiencing the world. Dogs didn't think like humans, but they clearly thought. They had preferences, emotions, individual personalities. Learning to understand and work with these differences prepared humans for the complex social interactions that civilization would require. The capacity for empathy, the ability to understand and respond to the emotional states of others, may have been significantly enhanced through thousands of years of human-dog interaction. Modern neuroscience suggests that the brain circuits involved in reading canine emotional cues overlap significantly with those used in understanding human emotions. In learning to interpret dog behavior, humans were also developing enhanced abilities to understand each other. This emotional sophistication is evident in the archaeological record through the increasing complexity of dog burials. By the late Neolithic period, dogs weren't just being interred alongside humans, they were being buried with elaborate grave goods, positioned in ways that suggested individual identity and personal relationships. Some burials include toys, tools, even food offerings that suggest belief in canine afterlife. These burials reveal something remarkable about human psychological development. For the first time in our species' history, we were consistently attributing personhood to non-human beings. Dogs weren't just useful animals, they were individuals with their own identities, their own roles in human society, their own claims to care and remembrance. This recognition of animal personhood had implications that extended far beyond the human-dog relationship. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans understood their place in the natural world. Rather than seeing themselves as separate from and superior to other species, humans were learning to recognize kinship, intelligence, and moral worth in beings fundamentally different from themselves. The lessons learned through partnership with dogs would prove crucial as human societies continued to evolve. The social skills, the emotional intelligence, the capacity for long-term cooperation that developed through thousands of years of human-dog interaction became foundational elements of human civilization. Cities, governments, religions, art, all of these cultural achievements built on psychological foundations laid during those ancient millennia of partnership with dogs. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the nature of domestication itself. The relationship between humans and dogs revealed that domestication wasn't about dominance or control, but about mutual adaptation, shared purpose, collaborative evolution. Both species changed in response to their partnership. Both became something new through their interaction. This understanding would shape how humans approach the domestication of other species. The patient, collaborative methods that worked with dogs were applied to sheep, goats, cattle, horses. The emotional bonds that made dog training possible became templates for relationships with other domestic animals. The recognition that animals could be partners rather than just resources transformed human approaches to agriculture and animal husbandry. By 7,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. The wolves that had first approached Paleolithic campfires had become something entirely new, a species so thoroughly integrated into human society that their survival depended entirely on continued partnership with humans. They had traded their independence for security, their fierce self-reliance for the comfort of belonging to something larger than themselves. But this wasn't a loss so much as a transformation. The dogs of the early Neolithic weren't diminished versions of their wolf ancestors. They were creatures specifically evolved for partnership, for cooperation, for the kind of interspecies collaboration that had never existed before in natural history. They had become living bridges between the human and natural worlds, creatures that could understand both but belonged fully to the new hybrid reality that humans and dogs had created together. This hybrid reality would prove remarkably resilient. Through all the subsequent changes in human society, the rise of cities, the development of agriculture, the invention of writing, the emergence of complex civilizations, the fundamental bond between humans and dogs remained constant. The relationship might take different forms, serve different purposes, be understood in different ways, but the essential partnership endured. The archaeological record from this period shows dogs spreading along with human populations into new environments, new continents, new ecological niches. Wherever humans went, dogs followed, adapting to new climates, new prey species, new forms of human society. They crossed ice bridges into the Americas, sailed with island-hopping peoples across Pacific archipelagos, trekked with nomads across vast deserts and steppes. Each new environment brought new challenges, new opportunities for specialization. Arctic dogs developed thick coats and powerful builds for pulling sleds across frozen landscapes. Desert dogs evolved lean bodies and efficient metabolism for surviving in arid conditions. Forest dogs became skilled at navigating dense undergrowth and tracking prey through complex scent trails. This adaptive radiation of dog populations mirrors the spread of human cultures, but it also contributed to it. Dogs weren't just passengers in human expansion, they were enablers, partners whose specialized abilities made it possible for humans to thrive in environments that would otherwise have been marginal or impossible to inhabit. The story of how wolves became dogs is ultimately a story about the transformative power of cooperation. Two species that might have remained competitors or even enemies discovered that they could achieve more together than either could accomplish alone. In the process, they changed each other in ways that were profound, permanent, and mutually beneficial. But the transformation wasn't just biological or behavioral, it was also psychological, emotional, spiritual. In learning to live with dogs, humans developed new capacities for empathy, loyalty, unconditional love. Dogs, in turn, evolved the ability to form emotional bonds that transcended their own species, to find meaning and purpose in service to beings fundamentally different from themselves. This emotional dimension of the human-dog relationship may be its most significant legacy. The capacity for love, loyalty, and trust that developed through thousands of years of partnership with dogs became foundational elements of human psychology. These emotional skills made possible the complex social relationships that civilization would require. The ability to maintain bonds with non-relatives, to cooperate with strangers, to sacrifice immediate interests for long-term collective goals. The bond between humans and dogs also demonstrated something crucial about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. Dogs clearly thought, felt, remembered, planned, but they did so in ways that were distinctively canine rather than imitations of human cognition. This recognition that intelligence could take radically different forms while remaining genuine and valuable helped prepare humans for the diverse forms of consciousness they would encounter as their societies became more complex. As we reach the end of this ancient story, we find ourselves at the threshold of recorded history. By 6,000 years ago, humans in various parts of the world were beginning to develop writing systems, formal governments, monumental architecture. The partnership with dogs had helped make all of these achievements possible by teaching humans the social and emotional skills that complex societies require. But the story doesn't end there. The bond forged in ice and hunger around Paleolithic fires continues to evolve, to adapt, to find new expressions in each generation. Modern dogs are the living descendants of those first brave wolves who chose to approach human camps rather than flee from them. In their genes, in their behaviours, in their capacity for cross-species love, they carry the memory of that ancient choice. And humans? We carry the memory too, though often without recognising it. Every time we feel comforted by a dog's presence, every time we find ourselves capable of unconditional love, every time we choose cooperation over competition, we're expressing capacities that were shaped by thousands of years of partnership with beings who thought differently but cared deeply. The transformation from wolf to dog represents one of the most successful examples of mutualistic evolution in natural history. Two species discovered that they could become more than the sum of their parts, that cooperation could be more powerful than competition, that differences could be sources of strength rather than division. The lessons learned during those ancient millennia of partnership remain relevant today, offering insights into how different species, different cultures, different forms of consciousness can learn to live together in ways that benefit all. In the end, the story of how wolves became dogs is really a story about becoming, about the endless capacity of life to transform itself, to find new forms, to create relationships that transcend the boundaries that seem to separate one kind of being from another. It's a story about the courage required to trust across differences, the patience needed to build understanding between minds that work in fundamentally different ways, and the profound rewards that await those willing to open their hearts to forms of consciousness unlike their own. The fire that burned in those Paleolithic camps has long since turned to ash, but its warmth continues in every interaction between human and dog, in every moment of cross-species understanding, in every recognition that consciousness and love can bridge even the vastest evolutionary distances. The bond that began in ice and uncertainty has become one of the defining features of what it means to be human, a reminder that our greatest achievements come not from conquering the natural world, but from learning to live within it as partners, allies, and friends. But the true test of this ancient partnership was yet to come. Around 12,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets finally retreated for good, both humans and their canine companions faced a challenge that would determine whether their bond was strong enough to survive the end of the world they had known together. The warming climate didn't just melt glaciers, it melted entire ways of life. The vast steppes that had supported mammoth herds for millennia gave way to dense forests. The reliable patterns of Ice Age existence dissolved into something chaotic and unpredictable. Both species found themselves in a world that felt alien, where the survival strategies that had worked for thousands of generations suddenly became obsolete. In this moment of unprecedented change, something remarkable happened. Rather than reverting to their ancient roles as competitors, humans and dogs deepened their partnership. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of innovation in how the two species worked together, as if the crisis had catalyzed new forms of cooperation that neither could have achieved alone. In the marshlands of northern Europe, we find evidence of dogs being used for entirely new purposes. At sites like Starcar in England, dated to around 11,000 years ago, dog remains show distinctive wear patterns on their bones, signs of animals that had spent their lives in and around water. These weren't the lean, rangy hunters of the Ice Age steppes. These were specialized aquatic workers, dogs bred and trained to retrieve waterfowl from icy lakes and streams. The sophistication of this relationship is breathtaking when you consider what it required. A retriever dog must learn to work at a distance from its human partner, to respond to whistle commands across hundreds of yards of open water, to distinguish between different types of game birds, to retrieve gently without damaging the catch. This wasn't instinctive behavior. It was learned, cultural knowledge passed from human to dog through generations of patient training. But perhaps more significantly, it required humans to think about dogs in entirely new ways. These weren't just scavengers or guards anymore. They were skilled professionals, specialists whose abilities complemented and enhanced human hunting strategies. The relationship had evolved from simple coexistence to genuine collaboration. The genetic evidence from this period reveals rapid changes in dog populations across Europe and Asia. DNA extracted from ancient bones shows increasing diversity in size, shape, and behavior, suggesting that humans were becoming sophisticated breeders, selecting for traits that had never been important in wild wolves. Some dogs were becoming smaller and more agile, suited for chasing prey through dense underbrush. Others were growing larger and more powerful, capable of bringing down animals that would have challenged entire wolf packs. This diversification wasn't random. It reflected the increasingly complex demands of post-glacial life. As human societies adapted to new environments, they needed canine partners with specialized skills. Forest hunting required different abilities than open plain hunting. Coastal fishing demanded different traits than inland fowling. Dogs were adapting alongside their human partners, becoming as diverse and specialized as human cultures themselves. The transformation was neurological as well as physical. Brain scans of modern dogs reveal that different breeds have dramatically different neural architectures. Sighthounds have enlarged visual processing centers. Scent hounds have expanded olfactory regions. Herding dogs show enhanced areas associated with spatial reasoning and movement control. These aren't just random variations. They represent systematic rewiring of canine consciousness to match specific human needs. But the most profound changes were happening in the realm of communication. By 10,000 years ago, dogs had evolved abilities that remain unique among non-human animals. They could follow human pointing gestures, understand complex verbal commands, even read human facial expressions with remarkable accuracy. No other species, not even our closest primate relatives, shows this level of interspecies communication ability. This wasn't one-sided adaptation. Humans were evolving too, developing enhanced abilities to read canine body language, to interpret different types of barks and whines, to understand the subtle signals that dogs use to communicate their intentions and emotional states. Modern parents instinctively understand what their dog is trying to tell them, often more clearly than they understand the needs of their own children. The archaeological record from this period also shows the first clear evidence of dogs being treated as individuals rather than just useful animals. Burials become more elaborate, more personal, At Skateholm in Sweden, archaeologists discovered a dog cemetery dating to around 7,000 years ago. The dogs were buried individually, in carefully dug graves with their own grave goods. Antler tools, amber beads, even food offerings that suggest their human companions expected them to need provisions in an afterlife. One burial in particular tells a story that still resonates across the millennia. An elderly dog, clearly arthritic and long past its working years, was buried with special care. Its grave goods included a beautifully carved antler comb and a collection of small stones that had been deliberately selected for their unusual colours and shapes. This wasn't the burial of a working animal that had outlived its usefulness. This was the funeral of a beloved family member, someone whose death was genuinely mourned. These burials reveal something profound about human psychological evolution. For the first time in our species' history, we were consistently recognizing non-human beings as individuals deserving of respect, care, and remembrance. The capacity to grieve for the death of another species represents a level of empathy that was unprecedented in the animal kingdom. This emotional sophistication had practical implications as well. Humans who could form deep bonds with dogs were also better equipped to maintain the complex social relationships that settled life required. Villages needed people who could cooperate with neighbours, resolve conflicts peacefully, care for the young and elderly. The emotional skills developed through partnership with dogs prepared humans for these challenges. The spread of agriculture around 9,000 years ago created new opportunities for human-dog cooperation. The first farmers needed help protecting their crops from wild animals, their livestock from predators, their stored grain from rodents. Dogs proved remarkably adaptable to these new roles, but success required even higher levels of training and socialization than had been needed during the hunting and gathering era. A sheepdog must learn to control the movements of prey animals without harming them, a complete reversal of natural predatory instincts. This requires not just physical training, but psychological transformation. The dog must learn to find satisfaction in controlling rather than killing, to work for delayed rather than immediate rewards, to respond to complex commands even when every instinct says otherwise. The development of herding behaviour represents one of the most sophisticated examples of learned behaviour in the animal kingdom. Modern herding dogs can control the movements of hundreds of sheep using nothing but body position, eye contact, and precisely timed movements. They can work independently for hours while remaining responsive to distant whistle commands from their human partners. This level of cognitive complexity rivals that found in many human activities. But herding required more than just smart dogs. It required humans who understood how to teach, train, and communicate with animals, whose minds worked very differently from their own. The development of effective dog training techniques represented a breakthrough in human understanding of learning, memory, and behaviour that would later be applied to education, child rearing, and social organisation. The genetic basis of these remarkable abilities is only now becoming clear. Recent studies have identified specific gene variants associated with trainability, social bonding, and stress response in dogs. Some of these genes affect the production of neurotransmitters like oxytocin and serotonin, creating biochemical reward systems that make dogs literally addicted to human approval. Other genetic changes affected the timing of brain development. Dogs evolved to retain juvenile characteristics throughout their lives, a process called neoteny. Adult dogs bark, play, and seek attention, much like wolf puppies, but they never fully mature into the independent, self-reliant adults that their wild ancestors became. In effect, dogs evolved to remain psychologically dependent on humans throughout their lives. This psychological dependency wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that allowed dogs to integrate more fully into human society than any other domesticated animal. A horse or cow can be trained to work with humans, but a dog lives with humans, sharing their emotional lives, responding to their moods, participating in their social relationships. The neurological changes that made this integration possible came with trade-offs. Dogs lost much of their ancestors' ability to survive independently in wild environments. They became less capable of hunting large prey, less able to navigate complex natural environments, more vulnerable to predators and environmental stresses. In exchange, they gained abilities that were perfectly suited for life in human society. This trade-off reveals something important about the nature of evolution itself. Natural selection doesn't always favor the strongest or most independent organisms. Sometimes it favors those that can form the most effective partnerships, those that can specialize in ways that complement the abilities of their allies. By 8,000 years ago, this process of coevolution had produced dogs that would be immediately recognizable to us today. Archaeological sites across Europe and the Middle East contain remains of animals that clearly represent distinct breeds. Large mastiff types suited for guarding, smaller terrier-like animals bred for hunting rodents, medium-sized dogs that served as general-purpose companions and workers. The diversity of these early breeds suggests that humans had developed sophisticated understanding of inheritance and selective breeding long before they had any scientific explanation for how genetics worked. They knew that breeding dogs with particular traits would tend to produce offspring with similar characteristics, and they used this knowledge systematically to create animals suited for specific purposes. This empirical understanding of genetics had implications that extended far beyond dog breeding. The same principles that governed canine inheritance could be applied to crops, to livestock, eventually to understanding human heredity itself. In learning to breed dogs, humans were developing the conceptual foundations for agriculture, animal husbandry, and ultimately for scientific thinking about heredity and variation. The psychological impact of this relationship continued to deepen as human societies became more complex. Living with dogs taught humans to think about other minds, other forms of consciousness, other ways of experiencing the world. Dogs clearly thought and felt, but they did so in distinctly non-human ways. Learning to understand and work with these differences prepared humans for the complex social interactions that civilization would require. The capacity for empathy, the ability to understand and respond to the emotional states of others, may have been significantly enhanced through thousands of years of human-dog interaction. Modern brain imaging studies suggest that the neural circuits involved in reading canine emotional cues overlap substantially with those used in understanding human emotions. In learning to interpret dog behavior, humans were also developing enhanced abilities to understand each other. This emotional sophistication becomes visible in the archaeological record through increasingly elaborate dog burials and artistic representations. By the late Neolithic period, dogs weren't just being interred alongside humans, they were being commemorated in art, appearing in cave paintings, carved figurines, and decorative pottery. These artistic depictions show dogs in clearly domestic contexts, wearing collars, playing with children, participating in hunting scenes alongside human figures. The appearance of collars is particularly significant because it represents a conceptual breakthrough in how humans thought about their relationship with dogs. A collar isn't just a tool for control, it's a symbol of belonging, a visible marker that this animal is part of a human family. The earliest collars found in archaeological contexts are often elaborately decorated with carved designs or precious materials, suggesting they served ceremonial as well as practical purposes. Some of the most remarkable evidence for the depth of human-dog bonds comes from sites where dogs appear to have been deliberately killed to accompany deceased humans into the afterlife. While this practice might seem cruel by modern standards, it actually reveals the profound value that these ancient peoples placed on their canine companions. These weren't casual sacrifices of disposable animals, they were costly offerings of beloved family members, reflecting beliefs that the bonds between humans and dogs transcended death itself. The spread of these beliefs and practices across vast geographic distances suggests that the human-dog relationship had become a fundamental element of human culture. From the Arctic tundra to tropical forests, from isolated islands to continental heartlands, wherever humans established communities, similar patterns of human-dog cooperation emerged. This wasn't coincidence, it was evidence that the partnership had become essential to human survival strategies. By 7,000 years ago, dogs were accompanying human migrations into virtually every habitable environment on Earth. They crossed land bridges into the Americas, sailed with island-hopping peoples across the Pacific, trekked with nomads across vast deserts and steppes. Each new environment brought new challenges, new opportunities for specialization, new forms of cooperation between species. The adaptability of the human-dog partnership proved crucial as human societies continued to evolve. The rise of cities, the development of complex governments, the emergence of specialized professions, all of these cultural achievements built on social and emotional foundations that had been laid during thousands of years of cooperation with dogs. The lessons learned through partnership with dogs, patience, loyalty, the ability to communicate across differences, the capacity to form lasting bonds based on mutual benefit rather than dominance, became foundational elements of human civilization. Without these psychological tools, the complex social relationships that cities require would have been impossible to maintain. But perhaps the most important legacy of this ancient partnership was the recognition that intelligence and consciousness could take radically different forms while remaining genuine and valuable. Dogs thought differently than humans, but they clearly thought. They had emotions, preferences, individual personalities. Learning to respect and work with these differences prepared humans for the diversity of minds and cultures they would encounter as their societies became more interconnected. The story of how wolves became dogs is ultimately a story about the transformative power of cooperation, about what becomes possible when different forms of consciousness learn to work together rather than against each other. Two species that might have remained eternal competitors discovered that they could achieve more together than either could accomplish alone. The transformation wasn't just biological, it was psychological, emotional, spiritual. In learning to live with dogs, humans developed new capacities for love, loyalty, and trust that transcended species boundaries. Dogs, in turn, evolved the ability to find meaning and purpose in service to beings fundamentally different from themselves. This mutual transformation created something unprecedented in natural history, a partnership so successful, so adaptive, so emotionally satisfying that it has endured virtually unchanged for thousands of years. Through all the subsequent revolutions in human society, agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, the digital age, the fundamental bond between humans and dogs has remained constant. The relationship might take different forms, serve different purposes, be understood in different ways, but the essential partnership endures. Modern dogs are still the living descendants of those first brave wolves who chose to approach human camps rather than flee from them. In their genes, in their behaviors, in their capacity for cross-species love, they carry the unbroken memory of that ancient choice. And we carry the memory too, though often without recognizing it, every time we feel comforted by a dog's presence, every time we find ourselves capable of unconditional love, every time we choose cooperation over competition. We're expressing capacities that were shaped by thousands of years of partnership with beings who thought differently but cared deeply. The fire that burned in those Paleolithic camps turned to ash long ago, but its warmth continues in every interaction between human and dog, in every moment of cross-species understanding, in every recognition that consciousness and love can bridge even the vastest evolutionary distances. The bond that began in ice and uncertainty has become one of the defining features of what it means to be human. A reminder that our greatest achievements come not from conquering the natural world, but from learning to live within it as partners, allies, and friends. The transformation from wolf to dog represents more than just an interesting chapter in natural history. It's a template for understanding how different forms of consciousness can learn to cooperate, how trust can develop across seemingly impossible differences, how partnership can transform both parties in ways that neither could achieve alone. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were 30,000 years ago, offering insights into how we might build more cooperative relationships with other species, other cultures, other ways of being in the world. As we stand at our own moment of unprecedented change, facing challenges that require new forms of cooperation and understanding, perhaps we can find inspiration in this ancient story of two species that looked across the divide of difference and chose to trust rather than fear, to cooperate rather than compete, to love rather than merely survive. The bond that began with a wolf's cautious glance across firelight was about to face its greatest test. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice sheets melted into memory and forests crept across landscapes that had been frozen for millennia, both humans and their canine partners found themselves in a world that demanded entirely new forms of cooperation. The archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of rapid adaptation. At sites like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, we find something unprecedented. Dogs living not at the edges of human settlements, but integrated into the very heart of domestic life. These weren't the opportunistic scavengers of earlier millennia. They were residents, with designated sleeping areas near human hearths, with clear roles in daily routines, with their own places in the emerging social hierarchies of settled communities. The physical transformation of these animals had accelerated dramatically. By this point, many of the canids found in human settlements would be immediately recognizable as dogs rather than wolves. Their skulls had shortened and broadened, their teeth had become smaller and more crowded, their bodies had adapted to a diet increasingly dependent on human food scraps. But the most profound changes were happening inside their heads. Modern brain imaging reveals that dogs evolved enlarged regions associated with social cognition, while areas linked to independent problem-solving actually shrank. They were trading general intelligence for specialized social intelligence, becoming brilliant at reading human intentions while losing much of their ancestral ability to survive alone in wild environments. This neurological rewiring enabled forms of cooperation that had never existed before in the animal kingdom. Dogs weren't just following instincts anymore. They were learning complex behavioral routines that required abstract thinking. The first herding dogs, whose remains appear at early pastoral sites across the Near East, had to master skills that defied every natural predatory instinct. Think about what herding actually requires. A dog must learn to control the movement of prey animals without harming them, to work toward goals that provide no immediate reward, to respond to commands given from distances where they can barely see their human partner. This isn't simple training, it's a complete reconstruction of how a predator's mind processes the world around it. The genetic evidence from this period shows rapid evolution in genes controlling stress response and social behavior. Dogs were developing biochemical reward systems that made them literally addicted to human approval. Their brains began producing oxytocin, the bonding hormone, in response to human contact, creating a neurochemical foundation for the emotional attachment that would define the relationship. But humans were changing too in ways that are harder to detect in ancient bones, but no less profound. Living with dogs required new forms of patience, new skills in cross-species communication, new ways of thinking about intelligence and consciousness. The capacity to understand and work with minds that operated so differently from our own prepared our ancestors for the complex social relationships that civilization would demand. The emergence of agriculture around 9,000 years ago created entirely new challenges for this ancient partnership. The first farmers needed protection for their crops, their livestock, their stored grain. Dogs proved remarkably adaptable to these roles, but success required unprecedented levels of training and cooperation. At early farming sites across the Fertile Crescent, we find evidence of dogs that had been selectively bred for specific tasks. Some were large and powerful, clearly suited for guarding against predators and raiders. Others were smaller and more agile, bred for hunting the rodents that threatened grain stores. Still others showed the robust bone structure and specialized wear patterns that suggest they were being used as beasts of burden, helping to transport goods between settlements. This diversification wasn't happening randomly, wasn't. Humans had developed sophisticated understanding of inheritance and selective breeding, knowledge that they applied systematically to create animals suited for particular purposes. They understood that breeding dogs with certain traits would tend to produce offspring with similar characteristics, and they used this knowledge to engineer living tools perfectly adapted to their needs. The psychological implications of this relationship continued to deepen. Dogs weren't just working animals, they were becoming integrated into human families in ways that had profound effects on both species. Children growing up with dogs developed enhanced empathy and communication skills. Adults learned to read non-verbal cues and emotional states across species boundaries. The archaeological record from this period shows increasingly elaborate dog burials that reveal the depth of these emotional bonds. At sites like Skatholm in Sweden, dogs were interred in individual graves with their own sets of grave goods. Carved antler tools, amber ornaments, carefully selected stones. These weren't utilitarian burials. They were expressions of grief, remembrance, love. One particularly moving example comes from a site where an elderly, arthritic dog was buried with special ceremony, despite clearly having been unable to work for years before its death. The grave goods included a beautifully crafted bone comb and a collection of unusual shells that must have been traded from distant coasts. This was the funeral of a family member, not the disposal of a worn-out tool. These burials mark a crucial threshold in human psychological development. For the first time in our species' history, we were consistently recognizing individual identity and moral worth in beings from other species. The capacity to grieve for animals, to see them as individuals deserving of respect and remembrance, represented an unprecedented expansion of empathy. This emotional sophistication had practical benefits as well. Humans who could form deep bonds with dogs were better equipped to maintain the complex social relationships that village life required. The patience needed to train a herding dog translated into skills for teaching children, negotiating with neighbours, caring for the elderly and infirm. By 8,000 years ago, the transformation was essentially complete. Archaeological sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas contain remains of animals that would be immediately recognisable as distinct dog breeds. Mastiff types for guarding, sighthounds for hunting, smaller companion breeds that served primarily social functions. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement was the development of working relationships that required genuine partnership between species. Sled dogs in the Arctic had to learn to navigate treacherous ice while responding to voice commands from handlers they could barely see. Hunting dogs in dense forests had to track prey for hours while remaining responsive to whistle signals from human partners. These relationships demanded forms of communication that transcended anything seen elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Dogs learned to interpret human pointing gestures, to understand complex verbal commands, to read facial expressions and body language with remarkable accuracy. Humans developed complementary abilities to understand canine vocalizations, to read the subtle signals dogs use to communicate danger, excitement, or distress. The sophistication of this interspecies communication system is evident in the specialized vocabularies that developed around dog handling. Different breeds required different training techniques, different command structures, different approaches to motivation and reward. Humans were developing empirical knowledge about animal psychology that wouldn't be formalized by science for thousands of years. The genetic legacy of this ancient partnership is visible in every dog alive today. Modern breeds retain the neurological architecture that made cooperation with humans possible. The enhanced social cognition, the reduced stress response, the biochemical reward systems that make dogs genuinely happy to please their human companions. But the human legacy is equally profound, though less visible. The emotional capacities developed through thousands of years of partnership with dogs became foundational elements of human psychology. The ability to form lasting bonds across difference, to communicate without words, to find meaning in service to others. These psychological tools made civilization possible. The spread of dog-keeping practices across human cultures reveals how essential this partnership had become. From Arctic hunters to tropical farmers, from nomadic herders to settled villagers, virtually every human society developed its own traditions of dog breeding, training, and care. The specific forms varied enormously, but the underlying pattern was universal. This universality suggests that the human-dog bond addressed fundamental psychological needs that transcended cultural differences. Dogs provided security in an uncertain world, companionship in isolation, unconditional loyalty in relationships often marked by conflict and betrayal. They offered a form of love that required no explanation, no justification, no complex social negotiation. The neurochemical basis of this bond has been revealed by modern research. When humans and dogs gaze into each other's eyes, both species release oxytocin, the same hormone involved in parent-child bonding. This biochemical response suggests that the emotional connection between humans and dogs isn't just cultural or learned. It's been literally wired into our nervous systems through millennia of coevolution. The implications extend far beyond the relationship itself. Learning to understand and care for beings so different from ourselves prepared humans for the challenges of living in diverse communities, of cooperating across cultural boundaries, of recognizing intelligence and worth in unfamiliar forms. As human societies grew more complex, dogs adapted to fill increasingly specialized niches. Temple dogs in ancient civilizations served religious functions, developing behaviors suited for ceremonial roles. Urban dogs learned to navigate crowded streets and complex social hierarchies. Military dogs were trained for warfare, developing courage and discipline that complemented their natural, protective instincts. Each new role required its own forms of training, its own breeding programs, its own traditions of care and handling. The accumulated knowledge about dog behavior, genetics, and training became one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated sciences, passed down through generations of practitioners who understood animal psychology with remarkable precision. The artistic record from this period shows dogs becoming integrated into human cultural expression. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative pottery all begin to feature dogs in clearly domestic contexts. These artistic representations reveal how thoroughly dogs had become part of human identity, symbols not just of utility, but of the bonds that made civilization possible. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this ancient partnership was philosophical rather than practical. Living with dogs taught humans that consciousness could take radically different forms while remaining genuine and valuable. Dogs clearly thought and felt, but they did so in distinctly non-human ways. This recognition prepared our ancestors for the diversity of minds they would encounter as their societies became more interconnected. The capacity to respect and work with cognitive differences, to find common ground across vast gaps in understanding, to build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dominance. These skills became essential tools for navigating the complex social world that humans were creating. The story of how wolves became dogs reveals something fundamental about the nature of cooperation itself. Two species that might have remained eternal competitors discovered that partnership could be more powerful than competition, that trust could bridge seemingly impossible differences, that love could transcend the boundaries that separate one form of consciousness from another. This discovery had consequences that rippled through every subsequent development in human history. The social and emotional skills developed through partnership with dogs became foundational elements of human civilization. Cities, governments, religions, art, all built on psychological foundations laid during those ancient millennia of cooperation with beings who thought differently but cared deeply. The transformation from wolf to dog represents one of evolution's most successful experiments in interspecies cooperation. It created a partnership so adaptive, so emotionally satisfying, so mutually beneficial that it has endured virtually unchanged for 10,000 years. Through all the revolutions in human society, agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, the digital age, the fundamental bond has remained constant. Modern dogs are living links to this ancient story, carrying in their genes and behaviors the unbroken memory of those first wolves who chose trust over fear. Every wag of a tail, every eager response to a human voice, every moment of cross-species understanding echoes across millennia to those original encounters around Paleolithic fires. And we carry the memory too, encoded not in our genes but in our capacity for love that transcends difference, for loyalty that endures hardship, for the recognition that consciousness comes in many forms and all deserve respect. The lessons learned through partnership with dogs prepared us for every subsequent challenge of living in a diverse world. The fire that brought two species together has long since turned to ash, but its warmth continues in every interaction between human and dog, in every moment when different forms of consciousness recognize kinship across the vast divide of species difference. What began as a survival strategy in the depths of the Ice Age became something far more precious, a template for how different kinds of beings can learn to love each other, not despite their differences, but because of them. The transformation from a wolf to dog changed both species in ways that neither could have imagined when that first curious wolf lingered at the edge of firelight rather than disappearing into the darkness. In choosing to stay, in choosing to trust, in choosing to build something new together, they created a bond that would outlast empires, survive ice ages, and continue to warm human hearts, long after the last echo of those ancient howls had faded into silence. This ancient partnership offers hope for our own time. When cooperation across differences seems increasingly difficult, the story of humans and dogs proves that trust can develop even between natural competitors, that love can bridge seemingly impossible gaps in understanding, that partnerships built on mutual respect and benefit can endure for millennia. As we face our own challenges of learning to live together in an interconnected world, perhaps we can find inspiration in this tale of two species that looked across the divide of difference and chose to build something beautiful together. The bond that began in ice and uncertainty has become one of humanity's greatest achievements, not because we succeeded in controlling another species, but because we learned to love them as partners, as family, as friends. That's a story worth remembering, especially on those nights when the world feels too big, too harsh, too lonely. Somewhere in the darkness, the echo of an ancient choice still resonates, the choice to stay rather than flee, to trust rather than fear, to love rather than merely survive. And in that echo, we might just find the courage to make our own choice to reach across whatever divides separate us from others and offer the kind of trust that can transform the world. The partnership that had sustained both species through ice ages and continental migrations was about to face its greatest disruption. Around 4,000 years ago, as bronze tools gleamed in Mediterranean sunlight and the first complex civilizations rose along river valleys, something fundamental began to shift in the ancient bond between humans and dogs. It wasn't a single moment of change, but rather a slow transformation that would have been invisible to those living through it. In the bustling markets of Babylon, the sacred precincts of Egyptian temples, and the trading ports of the Indus Valley, dogs were still present, still working, still loved, but they were no longer the essential survival partners they had been for 20 millennia. They were becoming something else entirely. Symbols, the archaeological record from this period, tells a story of increasing specialization and, paradoxically, increasing distance. In the tomb paintings of ancient Egypt, we see dogs depicted with unprecedented precision and artistry. Greyhound-type animals course through painted hunts alongside pharaohs. Smaller lapdogs recline beneath the chairs of wealthy women. These aren't generic representations of useful animals. They're portraits of individuals, carefully observed and lovingly rendered. But there's something unsettling about these images when you compare them to the simple burials of earlier millennia. The Egyptian dogs are beautiful, pampered, adorned with golden collars and precious stones, yet they seem somehow more distant from their human companions than the arthritic old dog buried with shells and bone combs at Skatehome thousands of years earlier. This wasn't abandonment, it was elevation. Dogs were being transformed from partners into possessions, from family members into status symbols. The very success of the human-dog bond was creating new forms of inequality within it. Wealthy households could afford to keep dogs purely for companionship or prestige, while working families needed every animal to earn its keep through labour. The genetic consequences of this shift are visible in the archaeological record through the emergence of dramatically different breed types. At sites across the ancient world, we find remains of dogs that had been bred for appearance rather than function. Extremely small dogs with shortened faces and bulging eyes, massive dogs with exaggerated proportions that would have hindered their ability to work effectively. These weren't accidents of nature, they were deliberate human creations, living sculptures shaped by selective breeding. The technology of civilization was also changing the nature of work itself. In earlier periods, dogs had filled roles that no human could perform as well, tracking scents across vast distances, detecting threats in darkness, communicating across species boundaries. But as human societies developed new tools and techniques, many of these functions became less critical. Walls replaced guard dogs in protecting communities. Written records replaced the memory functions that dogs had served in oral cultures. Professional soldiers took over many of the protective roles that had once belonged to large working dogs. The partnership was becoming less essential, more decorative. Yet something profound was being preserved, even as the practical relationship evolved. The emotional bond between humans and dogs, that neurochemical connection, forged through millennia of cooperation, remained as strong as ever. If anything, it was becoming more complex, more nuanced, more consciously celebrated. In the literature of ancient civilizations, dogs begin to appear not just as characters, but as symbols of loyalty, faithfulness, and unconditional love. The story of Odysseus's dog Argos, who recognized his master after 20 years of absence, captured something essential about the canine capacity for enduring attachment. These weren't just stories about animals, they were meditations on the nature of devotion itself. The religious traditions of the ancient world also began to incorporate dogs in increasingly sophisticated ways. In Egypt, the god Anubis guided souls through the afterlife with the head of a jackal. In Persia, dogs were considered sacred protectors of the dead. In Greece, healing temples often kept sacred dogs whose presence was believed to have therapeutic powers. The practical partnership was evolving into something spiritual. But this elevation came with costs that wouldn't become fully apparent for centuries. As dogs became more specialized, more removed from their working origins, they were losing some of the behavioral flexibility that had made the original partnership so successful. Breeds developed for specific purposes often struggled to adapt when those purposes changed or disappeared. The archaeological evidence from Roman sites reveals both the heights and the contradictions of this new relationship. In Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, we find evidence of dogs that lived lives of unprecedented luxury, mosaic portraits, elaborate feeding bowls, even what appear to be custom-fitted collars. But we also find evidence of dogs chained for their entire lives, bred for fighting, treated as commodities in ways that would have been unthinkable to their Ice Age ancestors. The genetic diversity that had accumulated over thousands of years of careful breeding was beginning to fragment into isolated lineages. Dogs were becoming more genetically distinct from each other than they had ever been from wolves. Some breeds were developing hereditary health problems, shortened airways, joint disorders, neurological issues, as the price of extreme physical modifications. Yet the fundamental relationship endured. Roman writers like Pliny and Columella wrote detailed treatises on dog care, training, and breeding that reveal deep understanding of canine psychology. These weren't just technical manuals, they were expressions of genuine affection for creatures that had become integral to human life. The spread of these Roman breeding practices across the empire created the first truly international exchange of dog genetics. Breeds developed in Britain were crossed with types from Egypt. Asian hunting dogs were bred with European guardians. The result was an explosion of diversity that laid the foundation for virtually every modern breed. But this genetic mixing also highlighted how much the original partnership had changed. The dogs being traded across imperial borders were valued for their novelty, their rarity, their ability to confer status on their owners. They were becoming commodities in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the humans who first shared their fires with wolves. The collapse of the Roman Empire around 500 years ago created new challenges for this evolving relationship. As trade networks fragmented and populations became more isolated, many specialized breeds disappeared entirely. The genetic diversity that had been accumulated over centuries was lost in a few generations of disruption. Medieval Europe saw a partial return to more functional relationships between humans and dogs. In feudal societies, dogs served essential roles in hunting, herding, and protection. But the knowledge of careful breeding was largely preserved only in monasteries and noble households, creating new forms of inequality in access to quality animals. The invention of firearms around 500 years ago began another transformation in the human-dog relationship. Many traditional hunting partnerships became obsolete as humans could kill prey at distances that made dogs unnecessary. Some breeds adapted by becoming more specialized: pointers that located game for guns, retrievers that collected what had been shot. Others simply disappeared. The Industrial Revolution of the past few centuries created perhaps the most dramatic shift in the relationship since the end of the Ice Age. As human populations moved from farms to cities, millions of dogs found themselves in environments completely unlike anything their ancestors had experienced. Urban life required new forms of behavior, new types of training, new ways of expressing the ancient bond. Modern breeding practices have created dogs more physically diverse than any other mammalian species, from chihuahuas weighing less than 2 pounds to mastiffs exceeding 200 pounds, from dogs bred for show rings to those designed for highly specialized work. The range of forms is staggering. Yet genetic analysis reveals that all of these varieties trace back to that same ghost population of Ice Age wolves that chose cooperation over competition. The neurochemical basis of the human-dog bond remains unchanged despite all these physical modifications. Modern dogs still release oxytocin when they gaze into human eyes. Modern humans still find their stress levels reduced by canine companionship. The biochemical foundation, laid down through millennia of coevolution, continues to function regardless of whether the dog in question is a working animal or a pampered pet. But something has been lost in this transformation. the mutual dependence that characterized the original partnership has become largely one-sided. Modern dogs depend entirely on humans for survival, but most humans could live perfectly well without dogs. The relationship has become optional in ways it never was during the vast majority of its history. This asymmetry has created new ethical questions about the nature of our responsibilities to creatures we have shaped so thoroughly. If dogs exist in their current form only because of human intervention, what do we owe them in return? If we have bred them to be dependent on us, do we have obligations that extend beyond simple ownership? The current global population of dogs is estimated at nearly 1 billion individuals, making them one of the most numerous large mammals on Earth. Yet many of these animals live as strays or ferals, struggling to survive in environments that their genetics have made them poorly suited for. The success of the partnership has created challenges that would have been unimaginable to its original architects. Climate change, urbanization, and technological advancement are creating new pressures on the ancient relationship. Some traditional roles for dogs are disappearing entirely, while others are evolving in unexpected directions. Detection dogs now search for everything from explosives to invasive species to medical conditions. Therapy dogs provide emotional support in hospitals and nursing homes. Service dogs assist with disabilities in ways that extend far beyond the traditional role of guide dogs for the blind. The genetic tools now available to breeders would seem like magic to their ancient predecessors. DNA testing can reveal hereditary diseases before they manifest. Artificial reproduction techniques can preserve endangered bloodlines. Gene therapy may soon be able to correct some of the health problems created by centuries of selective breeding. Yet for all this technological sophistication, the fundamental appeal of dogs remains exactly what it was 30,000 years ago, around Paleolithic fires. They offer unconditional acceptance, wordless communication, emotional support that requires no explanation or justification. In an increasingly complex world, they represent something simple and authentic. The COVID pandemic of recent years provided an unexpected natural experiment in the durability of the human-dog bond. As millions of people found themselves isolated and anxious, pet adoption rates soared worldwide. The neurochemical comfort that dogs provide proved as valuable in modern apartments as it had been in Ice Age camps. Modern neuroscience continues to reveal new dimensions of the relationship. Dogs can detect seizures before they occur, identify certain cancers through scent, even respond to human emotional states that their handlers aren't consciously aware of. These abilities suggest that the sensory partnership developed over millennia of cooperation retains capabilities we're only beginning to understand. The story of how wolves became dogs is ultimately a story about transformation, not just of one species, but of the entire concept of what relationships between different forms of consciousness can achieve. Two kinds of minds that evolved to compete learned instead to cooperate so thoroughly that they literally rewired each other's brains. This ancient partnership offers lessons that extend far beyond the relationship itself. It demonstrates that trust can develop even between natural competitors, that cooperation can be more powerful than competition, that love can transcend the boundaries that seem to separate different forms of consciousness. The bond that began with a wolf's decision to approach rather than flee has survived ice ages, civilizations, and technological revolutions. It has adapted to changes that would have destroyed lesser partnerships, finding new expressions while preserving its essential character. As we face our own challenges of learning to cooperate across differences, cultural, political, ideological, perhaps we can find inspiration in this ancient story of two species that chose trust over fear, partnership over domination, love over mere survival. The fire that first brought humans and wolves together has long since burned out, but its warmth continues in every interaction between person and dog, in every moment of cross-species understanding. in every recognition that consciousness comes in many forms and all deserve respect. Modern dogs carry in their genes the unbroken memory of those first wolves who chose to stay rather than flee. Every wagging tail, every eager greeting, every moment of faithful companionship echoes across 30 millennia to that original choice made in darkness and uncertainty. And we carry the memory too, encoded not in DNA but in our capacity for relationships that transcend difference, for loyalty that endures hardship, for love that asks nothing in return except the chance to continue. The lessons learned through partnership with dogs prepared us for every subsequent challenge of living in a diverse world. The transformation from wolf to dog changed both species in ways neither could have imagined. In choosing to build something new together, they created a template for cooperation that has outlasted empires and survived catastrophes. They proved that different kinds of consciousness can learn to understand each other, to care for each other, to become more than the sum of their parts. That's a story worth remembering, especially when the world feels divided and cooperation seems impossible. Somewhere in every dog's genome lies the echo of an ancient choice, the choice to approach rather than attack, to trust rather than fear, to stay rather than flee. And in that choice, preserved across thousands of generations, we find proof that love really can bridge any divide, that partnership really can transform the world, that the bonds we build with others, no matter how different they might be, can last forever. The wolf that became a dog didn't know it was making history. It was just making a choice, one small decision in a moment of hunger and cold and possibility, but that choice rippled forward through time, creating waves of change that are still spreading today, still bringing different kinds of minds together, still proving that the space between species is not a barrier but a bridge waiting to be crossed by anyone brave enough to try. And perhaps that's where the story should end, with choice still echoing through time. But there's one more chapter to tell, one that brings us full circle to the question we started with. What does it mean to have walked alongside another species for so long that we can no longer imagine ourselves without them? The answer isn't written in archaeological sites or genetic sequences, though both have helped us piece together this ancient narrative. It's written in something far more immediate, far more personal. It's written in the way a dog's ears perk up when they hear your key in the door, in the way your stress melts away when you feel their warm weight against your leg, in the moment of perfect understanding that passes between you when no words are needed. Modern science has given us the vocabulary to describe what's happening in these moments. We know about the oxytocin release, the synchronized brainwaves, the neurochemical cascades that create bonding across species lines. But knowing the mechanism doesn't diminish the mystery. If anything, it deepens it. How extraordinary that two such different forms of consciousness learn to literally sync their brain chemistry, to find comfort in each other's presence, to communicate across a divide that should have been unbridgeable. The dogs sleeping in our homes tonight are living time machines, carrying in their bodies the accumulated choices of 30,000 years. Every behaviour that seems so naturally canine, the way they follow us from room to room, the way they read our emotions before we're fully aware of them ourselves, the way they seem to know when we need comfort, represents thousands of generations of mutual adaptation. They are not wolves, and they haven't been for longer than recorded history. But they're not entirely separate from wolves either. They exist in a space that didn't exist before humans and wolves chose to share their lives. A space between wild and tame, between self and other, between what was and what became possible when two species decided to trust each other. This transformation teaches us something profound about the nature of evolution itself. We often think of natural selection as a competitive process, survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. But the story of dogs reveals another face of evolution, cooperation as a survival strategy, partnership as an adaptive advantage, love as a force that can literally reshape biology. The changes weren't just physical, though those are the easiest to measure. Dogs developed shorter snouts and floppy ears. Humans developed enhanced abilities to read nonverbal communication. Dogs evolved to remain psychologically juvenile throughout their lives. Humans evolved increased capacity for nurturing behaviours toward non-human animals. Both species became something they had never been before. But perhaps the most significant change was cognitive. Living with dogs taught humans to recognize intelligence in forms radically different from our own. Dogs think, but not like humans. They remember, but not like humans. They solve problems, form relationships, experience emotions, but always in distinctly canine ways. Learning to respect and work with these differences prepared our ancestors for every subsequent challenge of living in a diverse world. The capacity to see consciousness in non-human forms, to form emotional bonds across species lines, to find meaning in relationships that transcend biological categories. These became foundational elements of human psychology. The civilizations that followed built on emotional and social skills that were first developed through 20 millennia of partnership with creatures who thought differently but cared deeply. Today, as we grapple with questions about artificial intelligence, about communication with other species, about our responsibilities to the natural world, we might find guidance in this ancient relationship. The bond between humans and dogs demonstrates that consciousness can take many forms, that intelligence doesn't require human-like thinking to be genuine and valuable, that partnerships based on mutual respect and benefit can endure for millennia. The dogs in our world today face challenges their ancestors could never have imagined. Urban environments that their genetics weren't designed for. Breeding practices that sometimes prioritize appearance over health. A global population approaching 1 billion individuals, many struggling as strays in cities that have no place for them. The very success of the partnership has created new ethical obligations, but the fundamental bond remains as strong as ever. In hospitals, dogs provide therapy to patients whose own species has failed them. In disaster zones, they search for survivors with dedication that surpasses human endurance. In homes around the world, they offer the same wordless comfort that sustained our ancestors through ice ages and uncertainty. The neurochemical basis of this comfort hasn't changed. When you look into a dog's eyes and feel that familiar warmth, you're experiencing the same biochemical response that helped forge civilization itself. The oxytocin release, the stress reduction, the sense of connection across difference. These are gifts from an ancient partnership, still functioning exactly as they did around Paleolithic fires. Perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about this story. For all our technological advancement, for all the ways human society has transformed since those first tentative contacts in the Ice Age darkness, the relationship itself remains essentially unchanged. Dogs still offer unconditional acceptance. Humans still find comfort in their presence. The communication still flows both ways, wordless but profound. In a world that often feels fragmented, where differences seem to divide more than unite, the human-dog bond stands as proof that cooperation across difference is not only possible, but transformative. Two species that could have remained competitors chose to become partners, and in doing so, they changed the very nature of what it means to be alive on Earth. The wolf that first approached a human camp couldn't have known it was beginning a story that would outlast empires. The human who chose not to drive it away couldn't have imagined the partnership that would follow. But their choice, to trust rather than fear, to approach rather than flee, to build something together rather than remain alone, created ripples that are still spreading today. Every dog that greets its human with joy, every person who finds peace in a dog's company, every moment of understanding that passes between species carries forward that original decision. The bond that began in ice and uncertainty has become one of the defining features of human civilization. A reminder that our greatest achievements come not from conquering the natural world, but from learning to live within it as partners. As we face our own moments of choice, how to treat other species, how to cooperate across differences, how to build relationships based on trust rather than dominance, perhaps we can find inspiration in this ancient story. Two kinds of consciousness looked across the vast divide of species difference and chose to build something beautiful together. That choice is still available to us, still echoing in every interaction between human and dog, still proving that love really can bridge any divide, that partnership really can transform the world, that the bonds we build with others, no matter how different they might seem, can become the foundation for everything good that follows. The fire that first brought two species together burned out long ago, but its warmth continues. In every wagging tail, every gentle nuzzle, every moment of perfect understanding between human and dog, the ancient choice lives on. 30,000 years later, they're still choosing to stay, still choosing to trust, still choosing each other. And maybe that's the real message of this story. Not that we domesticated dogs, but that in the process, they domesticated us too. They taught us how to love across difference, how to communicate without words, how to find meaning in relationships that ask nothing more than presence and care. The transformation from wolf to dog was never really about changing one species. It was about creating something entirely new, the possibility of partnership itself, the proof that consciousness comes in many forms and all deserve respect, the demonstration that cooperation can be more powerful than competition. That lesson still echoes today, still offers hope for a world that often seems divided. Because if a wolf and a human could learn to trust each other 30,000 years ago in the depths of an ice age, then maybe, just maybe, we can learn to trust each other too. The story doesn't end with a neat conclusion because the best stories never do. They spiral outward, leaving questions that burrow into your thoughts long after the telling is done. And this story, this 30,000-year conversation between two species, it's still happening. Right now, in the space between your heartbeat and the soft breathing of whatever dog might be curled nearby, dreaming dreams we'll never understand, but somehow recognize. But here's what haunts me about this whole narrative. We spend so much time asking how wolves became dogs, when maybe the more unsettling question is this: when did we stop noticing that we were changing too? Because domestication was never a one-way street. Every generation that lived alongside these creatures was being shaped by them, moulded by their presence, altered in ways so subtle that the transformation became invisible. Think about it. For the vast majority of human existence, we lived in small groups where every face was known, every voice familiar. The psychological architecture of our minds was built for intimacy, for reading the subtle cues of perhaps 24 individuals. But dogs taught us something unprecedented: how to form emotional bonds with minds that worked fundamentally differently from our own. This wasn't just interspecies friendship. This was cognitive revolution, learning to understand what a dog needed, what it feared, what brought it joy. This required a kind of mental flexibility that prepared us for everything that followed. The empathy we developed through thousands of years of canine partnership became the foundation for every subsequent form of cooperation. Trade with strangers, diplomacy between tribes, the ability to see intelligence and worth in unfamiliar forms. Dogs were our first teachers in the art of translation, of communication across difference, and maybe that's why their absence feels so profound in cultures that have lost them, why something fundamental seems missing in places where humans and dogs no longer share their lives. We're not just missing companionship, we're missing a form of consciousness that helped shape our own. The archaeological silence in some regions tells its own story. There are parts of the world where the human-dog partnership never took hold, or where it was disrupted by later cultural changes. And when you map those absences against patterns of human development, something interesting emerges. The societies that maintained close relationships with dogs often showed enhanced abilities in cooperation, in managing complex social hierarchies, in developing sophisticated forms of non-verbal communication. This isn't to suggest some grand deterministic theory. Correlation isn't causation, and human societies developed remarkable complexity through countless different pathways. But it does make you wonder, what did we lose when we lost the daily practice of communicating with minds that thought so differently from our own? Because here's the thing that modern neuroscience keeps revealing: our brains are still wired for this partnership. 30,000 years of coevolution don't just disappear because we moved into apartments and started working in cubicles. The neural pathways that once helped us read a dog's emotional state are still there, still active, still capable of the same cross-species empathy that helped forge civilization itself. And maybe that's why this story matters now. In this moment when so many of us feel disconnected, isolated, struggling to communicate across differences that seem insurmountable, the bond between humans and dogs offers proof that trust can develop even between natural competitors, that love can bridge seemingly impossible gaps in understanding, that partnerships built on mutual respect can endure for millennia. The choice made by that first wolf to linger at the edge of firelight, and the choice made by that first human not to drive it away, these weren't grand gestures, they were small acts of courage, tiny decisions to trust rather than fear, but they created something that outlasted empires, survived ice ages, and continues to warm hearts 30,000 years later. So if you're listening to this in the quiet hours, if you're one of those people who finds peace in slow stories about deep time, remember this: the capacity for that kind of trust, that kind of love, that kind of patient cooperation, it's still there. Written into your neural architecture by millennia of partnership with creatures who chose to stay rather than flee, who chose to trust rather than attack, who chose to build something beautiful together rather than remain forever alone. The fire that first brought two species together may have burned out long ago, but its warmth lives on. In every moment of understanding that passes between different kinds of consciousness, in every choice to approach rather than avoid, in every recognition that the space between us isn't a barrier, it's a bridge waiting to be crossed. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to light the way forward. Thanks for wandering through deep time with me tonight, bored people. If this helped you think, or sleep, or simply exist a little more peacefully in a world that often feels too harsh and fast, then it did what it was meant to do. The timestamps are in the description if you want to revisit any part of this ancient story. And if you think others might find some quiet comfort in these slow tales from the deep past, well, you know what to do. Until next time, stay curious, stay calm, and remember, we're all just descendants of beings brave enough to trust across the vast divide of difference. That's not a small thing, that's everything.